I'm Catherine Buxton, and since discovering the joy of meditation in my late 30s, I've been on a journey of self-discovery that has introduced me to some fascinating ideas. Join me as I take a deeper dive into the areas of our well-being that we just don't give enough attention to. Would our lives really be any better if we took our well-being seriously? Each week I'll be joined by a well-being specialist to unpick the value of sleep, nutrition, kindness and so much more. This is Things You Should Care About podcast in association with Isbourne.org. So welcome to Things You Should Care About podcast with me, Catherine Buxton, in association with the Isbourne.org. I'm here this morning on a very cold February morning, 2021, with the lovely Amy Tindale. Amy, thank you very much for coming and joining us today. So you're living all the way in Essex and I'm all the way in Cheltenham, so we're brought together by the power of Zoom, which is wonderful. Have you been doing lots of Zoom meetings, Amy?
I have, yeah. I'm a pro on that now, like we all are, right?
Exactly, yeah, absolutely. It still catches me out occasionally, though, sometimes when they do an upgrade. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Amy, and what happened to you over the last few years.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. Nice to meet you. I guess I'm like my experience in the last year has been all about cancer, really. And kind of, yeah, cancer and mental health and healing is what I've been doing for the last 2 years, really.
Yeah. So how did the cancer diagnosis come about? What happened?
Yeah, it was quite complicated. And I think lots of people's experiences are quite complicated, actually, and sort of, you know, different misdiagnoses and that sort of thing. I think, yeah, it can be a very complicated story. And I think mine was quite complicated in that it was missed for quite a while. But then I was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. And that was in January 2019.
Okay, so that's a couple of years now since you've had that. You sound very young and you look very young, Amy. How old are you?
Thank you. Yeah, I've just turned 40 actually in December.
Well, you don't look 40, which is a compliment for you there. So is that quite young to be diagnosed at that age with ovarian cancer?
Yeah, I think so. I felt quite young for sure, I have to say. Yeah, I think so. But then actually when you are suddenly immersed into this world, you realise that cancer affects all ages, actually, you know, children, you know, young adults and adults and elderly.
Yeah, so it was a big shock for you, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, a massive shock. So when you got your diagnosis, what were your thoughts around it? Obviously, it must have been quite devastating for you.
Yeah, it was really difficult. And the first doctors I saw actually weren't particularly hopeful. And I was living overseas at the time. And yeah, they hadn't seen that type of cancer before. It was quite rare and they were all very surprised about it. And so I actually ended up coming back to London. Yeah, and found a doctor who had seen it like twice before, I think, in his 25-year career. So still a sort of rare thing. Yeah, but he was prepared to do the surgery actually, which the others weren't able to do.
So that's the route was surgery. You had to go down that route.
Yeah, I had a sort of a big surgery because it had spread. So I had big surgery and then 6 months of chemotherapy.
Gosh, that's a long time, isn't it? And did the chemotherapy make you ill? Make you feel ill?
Do you know what? I had no symptoms with it except I lost my hair.
Oh, so you're very lucky then.
Yeah, I mean, the hair loss is quite devastating. Do you know what I mean? That's difficult, I think, for many. And I'm involved in these communities now, and it is it's a thing for women, I think, particularly. So that is quite difficult. But I didn't have any tiredness even, or I don't know. I kept waking up, sort of expecting, you know, is this the day? This is the middle of the cycle where they say that you're going to start feeling ill and, you know, having all different symptoms. And I just never did. So yeah, I think it was, you know, quite fortunate in that way, but still challenging, you know. It's not easy. I had to travel up to London from Essex, and you know, you're there all day having these chemotherapy sessions, and I think actually the whole experience is just very fearful, to be honest.
Yeah.
So whatever sort of treatment you have, yeah, it's not an easy ride, you know.
No. And what was your life like? What was Amy doing before the diagnosis?
Yes, I had my own business. I was living in Ireland and working in sort of a corporate setting, kind of in sort of HR and recruitment for Google. was what I was my main business.
And was that very busy, very intense?
Yeah, it was. I'd been more busy, I'd say, when I was working actually in-house, and then I'd sort of set up my own. So I was working from home. So I actually had sort of taken my foot off the gas a bit already, if you like. And I'd lived out in Asia actually a few years before that, and I'd traveled for 8 months. And I think after that, I sort of thought I don't really want to go back to that sort of corporate world particularly. So I was doing a lot, of different things. And I've always been very into sort of psychology and mental health, and I've done yoga for a long time and meditation for a long time and that kind of thing. So I was actually really physically in very good condition when I went into it.
So what was it about the corporate world that was sort of disenchanting for you at that time?
I loved it, actually, I have to say. I really enjoyed. I worked for a business like one of the big headhunters, and that's where I had a graduate role there, and I was there for 8 years and enjoyed it. But I was living in London at the time for all of that time. But I guess it's very busy, isn't it? We all know. Do you know what I mean? It's quite hectic, and you're not necessarily doing the things that you love. You're doing things that you're sort of you're given the agenda, aren't you? Quite often. Mm.
So it wasn't actually really your passion.
No, not particularly, but I've always had a lot of side things on the go as well, because I work with kids in care as well as a mentor, and I've done that for many years. So, I've always had a lot of sort of voluntary roles as well, which I probably get more satisfaction from.
And obviously you've got a little dog there, I can hear.
Yeah, there's 2 dogs having a little fight here, actually.
That's fabulous. Are they lockdown dogs? Are they dogs that you got in the?
No, they're old. One's 9 and one's 4. Yeah.
Oh, okay, right. So they're getting on well together now.
Yeah.
That's good.
Kind of vying for the top position by my foot, I think.
It's nice and warm there, I guess.
Exactly.
So you had your diagnosis in 2019, is that right?
Yeah.
And that was followed by surgery, you said, and some and chemotherapy. And then what was the diagnosis after that?
Yeah, well, since they managed to get it all, it seemed, with the surgery. So I had sort of clear scans after the surgery, and I've continued to have clear scans since then. So a sort of 1.5 years of clear scans, which I don't know. I mean, yeah, oncologists are quite hard to sort of draw a smile from, I would say, although I do try. But a lot of them are quite, they're quite cautious types, and they don't like to overpromise, and that's fine. And it was quite interesting, actually, when I met with this new oncologist, and I talked about the sort of prognosis I'd received before, and he sort of said, well, I don't think that's, particularly helpful, because, we can't read the future. I'm a doctor, but I can't predict the future. Mm. And that was sort of, and it was quite a powerful sort of thing for me. And I sort of thought, okay, it's 50-50. I can kind of handle those stats. And I never really looked into the stats any more than that. I preferred to sort of make peace with that I don't know, if you know what I mean, rather than try and figure out what's exactly is going to happen. And I still sort of live like that now, honestly, as well.
So it's interesting that you say you're in your website as well, that you decided that you would make peace with this diagnosis that you had, which I'm really quite fascinated by, because cancer is everywhere, and I know people that have cancer, and I've spoken to people with cancer, and the whole kind of feeling around it is, I've got to fight this. I've got to absolutely fight this. This is awful. I'm going to do every fibre of my body is going to fight this and destroy this. And yet it feels from you, and from what you're saying, and also from what you said in your website, that you had a very different approach to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really tough experience, I think, and it's also probably very personal to some extent, as well as in like what sort of state of mind you come into it in. I think you really have to listen to yourself, actually, as well, and be guided by your like inner teacher, if you like, or how do you really feel about this, and what do you think is the best approach that's going to help you? Because I think having that belief and sort of confidence is very important in whatever way you choose to tackle it, but for me it was quite clear that like the fight wasn't the issue, because I've always been quite a driven, competitive person. Sometimes to my detriment, actually, I would say, and that's what I'd sort of discovered like over the 5 years sort of leading up to cancer, that I'm also quite a sensitive person, and actually being driven and competitive, it wasn't always helpful to me mentally, I have to say. And so my whole journey sort of 5 years before had been about relaxing actually, and letting go of that sort of driven sort of performance side of me, if you know what I mean. And I just thought, yeah, I don't want to go back to that actually. And so, but I know I've got a fight in me. I mean, I've been into competitive sports and, you know, a reasonable level and all of that sort of stuff. So I know that is in me, but for me, it didn't feel like that was what the experience was going to be about or what would help me.
How did you know that? How did that manifest itself? How did you?
I think I'm quite a sort of self-reflective person, I suppose, and quite into, like, I've done a lot of therapy. I'm into psychology. I mentor kids in psychology and with their mental health and that kind of thing. So I'm quite, and I read a lot, and I'm, actually in my job actually in HR, there's a lot of sort of mental health and stuff like that in leadership development in terms of how to work together and those sorts of things and look after yourself. So I sort of had a good grounding, I suppose, of experience in that world. And actually one of the thoughts that came to me when I first got ill was like, I want to enjoy something about this.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting take on it. Yeah.
Like, I don't just want this to be like a horrible period. Like, I want to enjoy something here. And my prognosis was very grave. I mean, let's like not beat around the bush with it. It wasn't like a nice one where they were optimistic. In fact, it was sort of quite the opposite. And so I thought, well,
even though you had a really horrible prognosis, you were determined to find something positive around it.
Yeah, and I think I thought that, like, when the doctors say they can't really help you, it's quite a sobering experience, because I hadn't really dealt with much medical stuff before this, honestly. And so I always assumed that doctors would always be able to help you.
Yeah.
And it was quite it was very shocking actually to be told, we don't know if this will work. And it kind of, yeah, I mean, and there was despair. I mean, you can't like lie about these sorts of things, you know what I mean? It was very, very difficult. And I kind of went into that despair as well at the beginning, at least, and was just in a bit of a state about it, like a lot of fear and anxiety and like this need to like control the future and not being able to cope with the unknown and all of that sort of stuff. Yeah, and then I had this experience actually, which I'll tell you about, which was quite like a sort of profound sort of experience for me.
Yeah, please do.
I'm quite a visual sort of person, and I do a lot of meditation. I'm quite fine to go inward and have these sort of experiences. And I was having a lot of despair actually for a time, and had a really bad day. This is before I had the surgery and before I even knew that surgery was an option. And I was sort of very upset, crying on the sofa, these sorts of things. And yeah, and then this question sort of popped into my head, and it was, has despair taught you anything before? And I was like, where did that come from? Like when it's not a thought you'd had before. It was very strange. It wasn't me. And then it said, have you ever got to the end of despair and found answers? And I was sort of thinking about it, and I was, it was quite easy, and it made me laugh because I have been in despair before as well. This wasn't my first sort of experience like of it. And I just had to sort of laugh and say, no, despair's never taught me anything before. Like, I've never got to the end of despair and found answers. And maybe it was quite personal to me, but it was a very funny question to be asking me. And then I had this like visualization, and often when I was in despair, I felt like I was in this big sea, do you know what I mean? And the waves are like getting me, and anxiety and fear and grief, and I'm this little body trying to keep above the water, quite desperate actually. And then I sort of, when I had that question, I kind of saw this like jetty, and I like a wooden structure, and I was like, oh, you know what, I can climb out of this sea. I don't have to be in these emotions. There is a place of safety. Like, I can go onto that pontoon and I can just sit and I can rest. And it was really powerful, and I sort of did that. And then it was actually a really sort of defining moment for me, because from there on in, really, I knew that I had this place of safety sort of in me, where I could go and I could be safe. And all these, I wasn't avoiding the question or the feelings and the stuff that was coming up. I was witnessing it and, accepting it, but I just wasn't being overwhelmed by it.
Yeah, that sounds lovely, because it's very similar to for example, like mindfulness meditation, which is something that I teach at the Isbourne, and it's around this idea of not becoming so immersed in your despair and your emotions that you've, like you said, you feel that you're completely overwhelmed and there's nothing to nothing's going to help you, but sitting on the jetty, being a little bit more objective, and being able to view it from a slightly safer place, or a place where you feel you've got some kind of stability, actually puts a whole different sort of perspective on everything in life. Yeah, it doesn't suddenly become you. You're able to actually see it. Is that how it felt for you?
Yeah, I think so. I think that describes it really well, actually. And it was just this, like, every time, you know, because anxiety does come at you, doesn't it? And you panic, I think. You don't know what to do, right? And then when these feelings would come, I think it's okay, I can stay on the platform. Like, literally, that's what I was saying to myself. It's okay, I don't have to be in that. And I never really lost that sense of safety, actually, after that.
So you talk about making peace with the diagnosis. You want to feel peaceful around it. Is that something you've managed to achieve, and how have you done that?
Yeah, I think so. So, I mean, I think, I guess, like in any experience, you sort of think about your goals, don't you, I suppose, or what, you know, how you want to be, and what you want to feel like. And I didn't know if I would survive, honestly. Like, that wasn't really a guarantee. And so I think many people, like, when you have cancer, all you want to do is to survive. And, you know, I thought, if I'm trying to survive, I definitely didn't feel good when I was trying to survive. Actually, I felt really bloody horrible. You know, it was very desperate, because I didn't know if I would. So I'm trying to force something that I don't know if it's possible to happen, you know. And I didn't have confidence, but I had a lot of fear and a lot of grief, and I didn't want to just ignore that and pretend I'm going to be okay, because I didn't know that. Yeah, and so I kind of thought to myself, like, you know, what do I want? And okay, you know what I do want? I want to feel peaceful. I want inner peace. And maybe I want inner peace more than survival. And actually, I started to recognize that survival was actually like a barrier to peace for me.
Okay, yeah.
So I let go of the need to survive, actually. And when you do that, a lot of stuff comes up, obviously, like this desire to be there for loved ones, you know, and it's very primal, isn't it? That need to survive actually is. And so then I was like, okay, well, that's all coming up now. So what I need is tools that are going to help me deal with this horrible feelings that I'm feeling about that, the fear and the grief. And I sort of thought, you know, I hope maybe there are things I can use that can help me deal with that stuff.
And you found those things?
Yeah, I have, actually. Amazingly and quite surprisingly.
Well, often when you put it out there to the universe and say, you know, I'm giving up this something, i.e. this desperate need to survive, then the universe you could hear what the universe has to say to you, you know, rather than your mind being completely oblivious to anything apart from survival. Something else comes in to fill that space, and that's often what you need.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was like a sort of a letting go, a sort of giving up, but not giving up of like I'm not going to get better, but giving up of I don't know what to do here. You know what I mean? Like, actually, I don't know what I'm doing anymore. Like, I thought I was doing okay, and look at what's happened to me. And, you know, I haven't got any answers anymore. Like, and giving up of my own sort of agenda, if you like, if you see what I mean, on my own plan a bit.
Yeah, you surrendered.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good way of saying it.
And so what came in? What came in? What answers?
Yeah, well, first of all, I was led to Stoicism, which was just a really incredible sort of transformational like theory, really, for me, that I hadn't really heard of before. I'd heard of Seneca, actually, and I'd heard of a couple, actually only Seneca I think I'd heard of, but I didn't really, and I'd heard of Stoic philosophy and the word like stoical, but I didn't, you know, although I'm quite into psychology and philosophy, I hadn't really like got into it before, you know. So that was quite new, and that actually came about on the back of that experience where I had this, you know, where I found like the jetty and the place of peace, and I actually started to Google like having these emotions but not being consumed by them. I think I Googled something like that, and it came up with Stoicism.
Good old Google.
Yeah, exactly. And that was the beginning, really.
So tell us a bit more what you discovered about Stoicism. It's Roman philosophy, isn't it? Or started in Rome, is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Roman Greek. Yeah, and it's sort of 2,000 years old. So, similar time as the Christian Bible. Do you know what I mean? Or even before that. So very, very ancient. And it's quite incredible to think that like these ancient people have got things to share with like a modern woman in the 21st century. It's quite crazy. And for me, actually, like stoical, when we think of like stoic, we think someone that is uncaring maybe, or doesn't feel their emotions, and as you say, just gets on with it. But that's like what it looks like on the outside. But actually there's like the inner world of the stoic is the thing that I was sort of more interested in, and the thing that I sort of latched onto, if you like, and what helped me. Yeah, and it's really around it's really around sort of non-judgment, actually. So not judging situations, and actually taking back the power for yourself, and not being at the whim of what seems to be happening in your world, but realizing the power you have in the ability to perceive and interpret.
Oh, okay.
So it's a very, very empowering practice that puts it back onto you, if you see what I mean. So when bad, difficult things happen, rather than sort of thinking, oh, this is terrible, why has this happened to me, what do I do about it, and trying to fix stuff in the world, you focus on changing your mind about what you're seeing or experiencing.
And how did that look on a practical sort of day-to-day level for you? How did it manifest?
Well, it can be a complicated philosophy to get into, because it is so old and there's so many different translations, and there's many, many, many books on it, and lots of people have different experiences and interpretations of it themselves as well. But I kind of started with just the quotes online, actually. So you can just Google Stoic quotes and they all come up in a very simple format. So I started reading through them, and they were really powerful. And really it's about like what Stoicism is. It's about like your value, it's not the external situation that is causing your suffering, it's your interpretation of it. So it's your values, your beliefs, and your judgments that are causing your pain, not what's happening. And we actually all know that's true, don't we?
Yes, it absolutely is true. But it's interesting because that's a very similar thing to what mindfulness meditation is doing. It's sort of saying, there are different realities and different ways for you to be able to look at this situation that you're in. There are, possibilities of different possibilities here. How can you adapt and change your mindset? And I think a lot of people intellectually get that, but it's the putting it into practice that I think they find difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like what I've learned through this whole journey is that the practical application is the thing. And actually you end up not just doing it in your 30-minute meditation, but you can use it in every single moment of your life, and then you always have the peace. But that's been a journey for me to come into that awareness, and be willing enough to accept that is the way it has to be done.
Yeah. And can you give me an example of when that's happened for you, when something's come up and you've dealt with it and you've gone back and thought, oh yeah, I put into practice there's something that I've learned about Stoic philosophy?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, why don't I just share a couple of quotes perhaps that are really powerful to me, and I actually like use the quotes, and I'll tell you like how I use them as well. Yeah, but the one that really is just the one that makes me go, oh, I'm okay, I've got some power here, like it's not all lost, is Epictetus, which just is amazing for me, and I absolutely love it. So it's, do not hope that every situation goes your way, but hope that you can go with every situation.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, yes, I like that.
So that's amazing, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And also it's interesting because when we think about empowering, sometimes we think that being powerful means that you can control situations. You know what I mean? That you have that you are fighting to control what happens, and what the situation that you're in, that you are directing it in a way. And yet what that's saying is that in the giving up of that, something else, some other power comes into play. Yeah,
and that quote really is like the fundamental belief of Stoicism, which is actually only your values, beliefs, and judgments are in your control. Nothing else is. And maybe that's true, maybe it's not, but it definitely starts with that, doesn't it? Like it starts with you, and if you believe in the power, or experience the power of the mind to create your reality, well, you don't start with what you see, you start with who you are or how you feel.
And how have your beliefs and values, how have they changed and altered since you've been through this experience and found Stoic philosophy?
Yeah, so I think Stoicism was definitely like the starting point for me, but it wasn't enough, I have to say. Like I went on and found more things, but it was a really big sort of game changer for me. And if anyone wants to look at Stoicism, I would say like check out the quotes online, just with a very simple Google. And there's also another guy who writes really simple books about it and translations, and it's a guy called Sam Torode. And they're just very simple translations of Epictetus's books and also Marcus Aurelius's books. So that the three sort of main people in Stoicism really are Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, and Epictetus. So you can Google them and you can start. And how I use it actually is that quote that I use. I imagine like I'm with Epictetus, he's my teacher, he's my trusted teacher, and he's got his arm around me. And when I'm upset, he says, Amy, do not hope that every situation goes your way. Hope you can go with every situation. And I literally like use it like that in a moment of distress. Yeah, so it's very powerful. And there's other amazing ones like Seneca. Another good one that was for me was, it's not death that is frightening, but the fear of death that's frightening. Quite powerful. And another one would be something like, it's not the situation that causes your distress, but your interpretation of the situation. Yeah.
So often it's those kinds of wonderful quotes. They kind of just settle in you, don't they? They kind of open doors for you, or it's not like a huge right, I'm suddenly going to change this and do it this way, but it has a kind of more subtle growing effect inside of you. Yeah,
and I think when you're in distress, actually having something that helps in that moment is the thing that that's very powerful, isn't it? And you actually, it's not just a theory or a concept, you're actually using it in a moment of distress to help you. And I think then you see its power and you become more open to you, and it's a practice then that you use.
Do you ever have times, well, I can remember this very much, when I was going through some difficulties in my life. I used to have a lovely Buddhist teacher called Pema Chodron, who used to she's a Buddhist nun, and I used to love her books and things. And sometimes I'd be going through distress, and I'd be finding, I'd be in some sort of despair, and there would be a lot of judgment there, and there'd be a lot of blaming there. And I could hear her, sitting on my shoulder, a bit like your philosopher with his arms around you. She would sit on my shoulder, sort of whispering into my ear, Catherine, is this really true? Is this really what you want? And sometimes it would do exactly what it needed to do for me, which was to give me peace. But other times I would just flicker off my shoulder and just say, don't want to go there. I just want to sit in a little bit of righteous indignation. I just want to sit in a bit of despair. Is that a similar thing that you find sometimes?
Yeah, well, do you know what? I think that it's really interesting that you bring that up, and that sort of makes me think about this sort of positivity thing in cancer and how you have to be positive. Well, actually, I don't ascribe to that at all. Because how can you be told, oh, you might die? Oh, great, yeah, I'm really positive about that. It's not real, is it?
No, it's not. No,
it's not real. And I wanted to and I had to be very honest with myself about that. And I think, there is sometimes you want to put a brave face on for other people sometimes, and not to drag them with you because you want to try and protect your loved ones and that kind of thing. And that's absolutely fine. Put on that brave face. But I always think when I'm talking to people and sharing and talking about my experience, I always think, don't try and fool yourself. Because all these feelings, we are dark and we are light, right? We're not all light, and pretending that we are is just denial, really. And actually the gift is in the darkness, isn't it? And having those moments of like despair and fear, actually you have to, in my experiences, you have to go through that to get to the light, otherwise you're never going to move forward. Like, you're not going to always want to do this stuff, and there is resistance, and sort of accepting that resistance you know, and you know, having days where you make massive mistakes, and you know, hugely, you know, you might be very regretful about some of the things you said or how you talk to yourself or whatever it might be. But the power of this stuff that I've learned is it's an internal process, and that you have a bad moment, but you know what, it's in your power to have a better moment in the next moment. That's totally in your gift. And you can, and actually amazing tool for that is self-compassion, actually, which I also got really into. That is a way to turn around that, you know, the situation, but also, you know, accept, yeah, you're going to feel terrible, and actually having this stuff coming up, that's the healing. Actually, that is what healing is facing into all that stuff. And what we need actually in mental health and in cancer and probably in our lives is are tools that we trust, that can help us to look at all that darkness and bring it to the light, you know. And I think, if I'm honest with you, I feel like you know, you talk about the East and stuff, and you're obviously really experienced in this, but my other thing I've learned is I think our base level for, you know, what we say is good mental health is pretty poor in this country. Or maybe in every country, you know, like we put up with a lot of mental health distress and think it's normal. And I think, you know, we need to elevate what we call the base, you know.
Where would you like to see that base elevated to?
Well, I think that there has to be a lot of acceptance in the brutality of the human condition, actually. You know, you got to look at that. You know, and I've gone very deep with all this stuff because I wanted help. You know, and I think I have gone very deep. And, you know, the human condition, you know, is one of despair, actually. Like if you live your life thinking you're going to die, which, you know, most of us do, you know, at some point, death is a sort of certainty for many of us.
Yes, it's the only important thing, isn't it? When you're as soon as you're born, the only thing you know is going to happen is you're going to die.
Yeah, and you have to ask, don't you? Can I really be happy in that in that paradigm? You know, and I think, and death's a really interesting one, because I've looked at, you know, fear of death was one of the things that I had to cope with, actually, and look at and accept, but, you know, accept through looking at all of my fear and grief and anger about it all. And I think if you can do that, you do end up sort of find ways to transcend it. And my mind is completely changed about death now. I don't believe in, I don't, it's not even a belief really, is it? It's, my body obviously won't always be here probably, and I won't always be on this planet or this plane or whatever you want to call it, but I believe in eternal life, and I have a spiritual, I attach more to my sort of spiritual self than my human self, if you know what I mean now.
So do you think you've found more peace, Amy, now?
Yeah, definitely. And I've learned what the barriers to peace are, I think, and I can recognize them in myself, and I have tools that I can use to deal with them. So yeah.
And what are the barriers to peace?
Judgment.
Okay.
Judgment, separation. Yeah, thinking that we're like all alone and separate from each other in this place. Yeah, they're probably the big ones. Well, I think separation sort of leads to judgment, doesn't it?
Yeah, judgment of self and judgment of others.
Yeah, it's huge.
So do you find you have more peaceful moments than despair moments, or is it pretty equal? Or
yeah, well, do you know what? I think I would never say that I'm never going to have like despair again, because who knows? Like, I don't know what the future holds. You know, you know, I don't have total power over that. But what I do have is tools that I can use to heal. And so when I have despair, you know, this is probably a good sort of Stoic way to look at it as well, rather than, you know, be upset and angry and resistant that I'm having that despair. To me, it's a healing opportunity. Yeah, and so I use like self-compassion, I think we sort of talked about, is an amazing tool for just, it's a very different way of dealing with something. So, you know, normally when you feel ill and you sort of judge yourself, oh, why do I feel like this? Oh, I'm such a loser, you know, why do I feel like this? What's wrong with me? How come everyone else is okay and I'm not okay? Or the other way to deal with it is, it's okay because I'm going to get a new job, or it's okay because I'm going to get that promotion, or it's okay because I'm going to make sure, you know, my kids are more happy, or whatever it might be. And what you do with self-compassion is, rather than trying to change something in the world, you you focus on your distress and you come to your own aid with love, basically. So you stop doing everything, you stop trying to solve the problem, and you like love yourself. And there's a really amazing lady called Neff.
Yeah.
Do you know her?
I do, yeah.
Yeah, so she's a professor, I think, in psychology in Houston, isn't she, at Houston University? And she's written a book called Self-Compassion. I think it's something like Stop Beating Yourself Up and Leave Insecurity Behind. And that was an amazing book for me. And she talks about creating like a self-compassionate dialogue, so that when you're suffering, you have this dialogue, like it's quite sort of, feels quite formulaic in a way, but you just use it and you write it out, and you use words that are meaningful to you, like terms of endearment. So mine was something like, yes, my darling, this is really hard. And every worry, yes, my darling, this is really hard. Another worry, yes, my darling, this is really hard. And her sort of theory, and I think she's done a lot of research into it as well, is that you sort of, you come to your own aid with like loving words, and you also accept that suffering is part of the human condition. And isolation is a really big issue in cancer, and that's how I felt very isolated, like there was something wrong with me. And she talks about like accepting that suffering is part of the human condition, and then joining with others and think about others suffering. So in your moment of suffering, because I've got cancer, I think about a mother that's lost her child, or someone that's lost his job, or someone that's going through a divorce. And I think, we're all suffering, aren't we? We're all suffering. And it fosters this sort of connection in you. It's quite amazing. And it's sort of like, you can like love kind of like starts to bubble up in you. And you think, I'm going to love myself through this. I'm going to love all those people and let me feel that love flow from me, and it's very healing.
And how have you found your relationships with others have changed since you've been going through this?
Yeah, I mean, I would say this has been like an internal journey, actually. Yeah. And, maybe not everyone around me would subscribe to this sort of stuff actually at all. And they, they kind of don't need to, because it's a personal mission for peace, But I think that, I mean, I like to, well, I know actually, I suppose I made it as easy as possible for them in some ways, because I was doing a lot of this myself. And, this stuff, like, with meditation, it's going off to a quiet room and sitting quietly, and maybe, having like trauma and the tears come, but you kind of do it on your own. But I also like obviously have very good friends and family, and I would sort of talk to them as well.
Has it changed your relationship with them? Has it changed your perception of them?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, like, when you do all this stuff, you sort of start to recognize your own judgments actually, and how they are harming you. And actually, by condemning others, you're also condemning yourself. Like if you end up sort of subscribing to the kind of more like the oneness way of living, that we're all joined, whether you're condemning yourself or someone else, you're kind of the same person. So you're hurting yourself with that, and just learning not to do that actually, or to recognize it and give it away, rather than holding that condemnation. So I think my relationships have been good, and I probably put less emphasis on them in a funny way actually, and less need and less expectation of them. I don't need someone else to sort me out, like I'll do that for myself.
Oh, that's fantastic. Tell us a bit about this charity that you set up. It's called Carousel, is it?
Yeah, so I have a website. I think I just sort of wanted to share some of these tools that have helped me actually. And I've through this process, I've sort of read a lot and learnt a lot, and maybe I'll probably just keep adding sort of more book reviews and more tools on there. But it's really to help anybody who has trauma. And my experience actually is that cancer's a trauma, but all traumas are very similar. Actually, whether you're having a divorce or a bereavement or an illness, actually trauma is trauma, really. And so these tools can be used for anyone, but my website at the moment is more specific for cancer patients.
And anybody can access that, and it's
yeah, it's www.carouselmentalhealth.com.
Okay.
Anyone can access it, and it's sort of a work in progress. It's very sort of live and being developed. Yeah.
Right. And what's the one tool that you say has really made a difference to you? Is it the philosophy, the loving kindness?
No, do you know what it is? It's one I haven't mentioned yet, but it's Letting Go by David Hawkins.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know him?
I do know, yeah.
He's like my master. I love that man. Yeah, his book was a complete game changer for me. And that's the one that I use the most, actually, I have to say. And that really got me through some very, very hard times. So his book's called Letting Go, The Pathway of Surrender. Mm-hmm. He's written many, many books. I mean, he was a psychiatrist and then psychologist, and became more of a sort of spiritualist in his later years, practicing from sort of 1950 until 2012 when he died. Have you read Letting Go?
I haven't read Letting Go. No, I know David Hawkins, but yeah. I think I will go away and read it. In summary, what is it about it that really kind of captured you?
Yeah, so he gives you a methodology actually to use to when you feel these feelings. So he talks about like a scale of consciousness, and at the bottom you've got like shame, grief, anger, apathy, depression, fear, pride, and it goes up then to like ends up with sort of, you know, love, peace and joy at the top. But you can't get to those ones at the top before you've dealt with all of this stuff at the bottom. And he's very much like, it's not about, you know, what happened in your childhood and in your past. Actually, as a human, you know, maybe you have many, many lives, and you carry all of this grief and stuff in you, and the things that you see are kind of triggers for it, right? And so, you know, the question isn't like, are you peaceful or not? It's more, when those feelings come up, what do you do about them? And, you know, the typical ways would be to sort of repress it and suppress it, you know, or express it. And I always thought actually expression was the best way of dealing with it. So I've got very good friends that I would go and vent to, or I'd have it out with somebody and that kind of thing, which, you know, can work. But you can also be left with a lot more guilt actually if you overload someone, or you know, layer off at someone and you perhaps you shouldn't have done. So this is a way, he has a methodology where you know, you close your eyes, you sit quietly, you invite those feelings to come up into your awareness. And normally we want to run away, so it's very difficult. There's a lot of resistance to it at first, but you allow those feelings to come up at you. You say where you feel them on your body. Like often you feel things in your heart center, or maybe you feel it in your stomach or in your throat. And it's quite illuminating. And all you do is you just say, you don't, you know, you try and let go of the conceptual mind a little bit. So you don't think about the problem and try and solve it. You just focus on that. Okay, it's grief. Okay, this is how I feel grief. I feel it in my heart. It feels like a pressure. And you just say to yourself, I allow that feeling to come, and you just allow it to flood your body. And it is incredible.
And does it stay for very long?
I mean, I've done it for like hours and hours at a time. Yeah. And often you find is like behind that one feeling is another feeling. So often you might feel anger, but actually you realize beneath it is grief or fear. So you invite it all up, and then you see what you can let go of, and you say to yourself, you know, I let this feeling go. And often you get a, no, you can't. I don't want to let this feeling go. You know, and that's part of it too. And then so you say, okay, well, if I can't let go of it, let me just allow it to come again. And it's like an emotional sort of clear out, I guess.
Yeah. I think actually a lot of those things that you talk about, I think the underlying thing always is fear. Yeah, you know, even anger is fear. You know, the underlying is a basis of fear. Yeah, we do fear so much about things.
Yeah, and I think that for me is the thing. It's about like finding tools that actually work for you.
Yeah. So you've got David Hawkins sitting on one shoulder.
Yeah.
You've got your Stoic philosophers sitting on the other shoulder.
Yeah.
You've got Christine Neff deep in your heart.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Exactly. Yeah. And then do you know where I was led eventually after all of this work, and there was other ones that I used or was led to, but those three are probably very powerful ones. And the other thing I just want to mention is like, it's quite organic, like how you get led to things. Like I'm a kind of researcher by nature, and I'm very into this stuff. So it's quite easy for me to pick up a book and then, oh, self-compassion sounds interesting. Let me find out more about that, and then find a book on that. Or I check out the big bibliography at the back, or often authors kind of recommend another author. So I just like allowed this organic sort of development to happen, you know, of being led on this sort of journey. And then eventually where I was led to was A Course in Miracles, which I've been practicing for about a year, just over a year now.
And you find that's really helpful?
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing. It's very, very deep, very transformational about being a, finding out who you really are sort of before you came into this existence, like, recognizing your holiness and your eternal self, and your eternal self that is really unconditional love, and that's what, God is in you. And again, like finding the barriers to everything that stops you from just being unconditional love and God.
Yes, I bought the book, A Course in Miracles, and unfortunately it's been on my bookshelf gathering dust for a while. It's not an easy thing to get into, but yeah.
No, and that's it. I mean, it's like, that's what I learned through this process, actually, is like, when you're ready, the right thing will come. It's a very common phrase, isn't it, in this world? And actually, do you know what? Letting go, interestingly, I had that on my Kindle for about 3 years, and I actually bought it thinking it was another book called Letting Go. And that, and then that was like a seminal book for me,
It's interesting, isn't it, how the universe will send it to you, but you won't look at it until you're ready.
No, and that's it. And that's, you have to accept that as well. Like everyone's in different stages, needing different things at different times, right? And that's it, isn't it? There's no right or wrong in this sort of stuff. It is a personal discovery.
So what is the difference between the Amy pre this and pre your diagnosis and the Amy now that sits before us? What's the fundamental difference between them, apart from age and whatever else? But
yeah, I would say I've always been very loving on the outside to family and friends, but now that love is all that I am, and I have it for myself and for others as one, and that's a big difference, because I think before I knew how I was meant to be behaving and how I wanted to behave and what was loving, but I didn't always feel that deep in me.
I've got one last question for you. We ask this to everybody who's been on our podcast, and it is, what one piece of advice has someone given you that you'd like to pass on to others?
Yeah, I think that I'm going to give two, if that's okay. One that's quite practical, and then one that's more sort of spiritual. And the practical one actually was said to me from a psychologist in Ireland when I was very first ill, and she said to me, just say yes. And I was like, what do you mean? And she said, whatever help you get offered, just say yes. Can I do some washing for you? Yes. Can I make you a meal? Yes. Can I take you to an appointment? Yes. And that I think it was quite an amazing bit of advice on a very practical level.
That's great.
Yeah, and then the other one, I mean, sort of, I would call A Course in Miracles is kind of like liquid gold for the soul. Every line is profound, and like, how you might, if you've got it on your bookshelf, sometimes, like how I use it sometimes, if there's a problem, I just open it and just read something, and it, it's, you're being led to the right thing. But I think, a bit of advice in that is, you've always got the choice between love and fear in every moment. And that's your power. Your power of choice is yours.
Which brings you back to your Stoic philosophers, yes, because you have a power of choice, don't you? Yeah. Do you want to live in fear, or do you want to live in love? Well, I definitely know what I want to live in. That's great. And I will go back, Amy, actually, and pick up my dusty old copy of A Course in Miracles and do exactly what you said. Just open it up at a page and see what it says.
Yeah.
Well, it's been lovely talking to you, and thank you so much for giving us your time today. It's been great.
Thank you.
Anything else that you think that we haven't covered that you'd like to say?
No, that's brilliant. I mean, I guess if anyone's listening that has cancer or is having a hard time, I would say, like, go within. You have the answers in you, and do what you think is right for you. And if you're having cancer, especially, like, having sort of belief and confidence in the treatment plan, in what you're doing is key. And for me, the mental health thing was the key. But for somebody else it might be something different, but those answers are in you.
Good stuff. Well, all the best, Amy, for the rest of your journey, wherever it leads you and wherever it takes you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and thanks so much for joining us this morning. It's been fantastic.